Hello, everyone. My name is Aisha. I am deeply sorry that I am not able to be at the conference, but as you'll be able to tell from my sniffles throughout this presentation, it's probably for the best. But I am still excited to share my paper with you and hopefully contribute to the lovely discussions I'm sure you all will be having. My paper is titled What to Do About That Part, Re-inscribing Rape in Children's Literature. Children's literature is a potent transmitter of the fault lines that simmer under the surface of our societies and communities, right? If we want to understand a society or culture, we should look at the stories they tell their children. Greek myth enjoys a robust reception in children's literature. I take a pause here to acknowledge the fact that when I speak of children's literature, a reception, in children's literature. My lens in this current paper is very narrow. I'm looking at the popular series in American literature, children's literature currently. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge that before moving forward. So while Greek myth has is abounds with the dark accounts of sexual violence and abduction, um, its reception in children's literature does not, right? Um, and at the same time, those accounts are never wholly omitted or completely censored. Instead, those accounts are usually reshaped, they're reinscribed in some way, which is what I am interested in this paper and taking a look at more closely. So I ask, right, the questions that drive my inquiry are how do we inscribe narratives of, reinscribe narratives, that is, of sexual violence for children? And why do we reinscribe narratives of sexual violence for children? And what effect does that have on the reception of Greek myth? Right? To explore these questions, I will be looking closely at the myth of Persephone. So I'll be looking at the ancient source of the Homeric hymn to Demeter and the immensely popular middle grade fiction series called Goddess Girls by John Holub. And the book, particularly in that series, titled Persephone the Phony. I'll pause here to share these images before we move forward, just so that we can have a visual of what we're looking at. And what we're looking at here is this beautiful, amazing, very early 4th century fresco found all the way up in Macedonia. So, thinking of the geographical reach as well of the myth of Persephone. And here you see Hades and, abducting Persephone, as we'll see is depicted in the ancient sources. And Persephone, her clothes falling off her body, and she's, her body's hanging out as she's being ripped away from her home. And on the other hand, what we have, right, its reception in this particular series that I'm looking at with this called Goddess Girls and this particular book called Persephone the Phony, we see sort of how that's going to be reinscribed. The series Goddess Girls is particularly interesting to me because its target audience is girls of ages 8 to 12, right? It is made to every single book is focused on the protagonist is a female character, and the settings are such that it is supposed to attract an audience largely of girls from ages 8 to 12. And I think that the questions of how do we deal with these scenes of sexual violence for this kind of particular audience become even more pertinent to think about. What are we telling our girls? Um, so the argument that I will lay out is twofold. One, in reinscribing the rape of Persephone in a book such as Persephone the Phony, we are given an opportunity to question what is the myth of Persephone, right? What makes the myth still recognizable when it's changed in so many ways? And we're given an opportunity to reread the ancient sources with those questions in a fresh lens. That's the optimistic side of it. The darker side of things, right? Another second part of my argument is that in reinscribing the rape of Persephone, we're diluting the very heavy and relevant topic of the appropriation of the female body, and are potentially no less at fault of abusing Persephone as is Hades in his abduction. Um, so with that, I will transition into, I begin um, by looking closely at the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Um, the hymn to Demeter begins with the myth of Persephone's abduction and rape, and that in one way it's because both mother and daughter are so closely connected in mythology. But the linked story of Persephone's abduction and Demeter's time in Eleusis serve to elaborate the main concern of the hymn, which is the tripartite cosmic structure of the divine world, the human world, and the underworld, right? So here I have the first several lines. I've omitted a certain part that I'm going to come back to later, to keeping that for the next part of my argument. But I will read this passage and look closely with it. Um, I begin to think of Demeter, the holy goddess with the beautiful hair, and her daughter too, the one with the delicate ankles, whom Hades seized. Zeus, the loud thunderer, who sees far and wide, gave her away. Right, so Hades seized her, right, her paxe, and I've underlined the words, and she is, and essentially rapes her, and she is given Dokain by Zeus, and you can see that, those two words, like even their placement next to each other, emphasize the jarring sense of violence that has just taken place right before our eyes. Um, the extreme nature of this, the idea of Persephone needing to be seized and having been given by Zeus, um, you know, um, assumes is built upon the assumption that Demeter would not approve of this union if she had known, right? And this is because it's an extreme situation. In part, right, the marriage with Hades not only illustrates the usual conflation in Greek myth and Greek thought between marriage and death, but also that once married to Hades, right, Demeter will never be able to see her daughter again, right? So it is that it's not in any marriage. It is a marriage to Hades. It is a marriage that will remove her daughter to the underworld where no gods except usually Hermes are ever tread. And so it is again an extreme situation, because at one point during the hymn, Helios will tell Demeter that having Hades as a son-in-law is not the worst thing. He is an honored god. He has many honors. He has Time. He is not an unfit son-in-law. And it's not so much that there's something wrong with the character of Hades, but the fact that in marrying Hades, right, Persephone will be so permanently removed from her mother, right? Then that's sort of the extremity of the situation here. So I now go on to look at the description of what happens, right? Um, and the earth, full of roads leading every way, opened up, and this happened on the plain of Nisa, where the Lord, who receives many guests, made his lunge. So Hades makes his lunge, riding on a chariot drawn by immortal horses. Hades, the son of Kronos, the one known by many names. He seized her against her will, Persephone, put her on his golden chariot, and drove away as she wept. She cried with a piercing voice, calling upon her father, the son of Kronos, the highest and the best, but not one of the immortal ones, or the human mortals, or the beautiful, I love it, beautiful olive trees, heard her voice, right? Um, and you know, we should remember that this is happening by the divine sanction of Zeus, right? This is part of Zeus's plan, that he has given Hades the permission and the divine agency to go ahead and take Persephone. The Greek is obviously playing with the word phone, voice, the word for voice here, as I've underlined it, as well in the Greek and in the English, right? As part as phone as a part of Persephone's name, as part of her etymological sort of roots of her name. And this tension, right, and it brings forth this phone where she first has this piercing voice, but then it's a voice that isn't heard, right? There's this tension between her voice that is present and unheard, right, at the same time. And I argue that this sort of tension of her phone, right, is a signification of consent, right? That her consent in this idea that it's her voice is both at the same time piercing and loud, her phone, but at the same time her phone is unheard, is a signification of the lack of her consent as to what is happening. Um, Having seen, okay, now having looked at this scene, I'm going to move on to looking at what is the interaction, the initial interaction between Hades and Persephone in Persephone the Phony. So we take a look now at Persephone the Phony, the middle grade fiction series, and I call it here. There is no abduction, right? Spoiler alert: there is no abduction, there is no rape, there is no sexual violence. Here, Persephone is going to meet Hades, and I call it their meet cute, right? And so I begin here with something I just left off with in the slide before, which is Persephone's phone, her voice, right? And here, as you'll see in this passage, Holub is similarly playing with the English name Persephone, as are the Greeks, and as are the Greek in the Homeric hymn to Demeter is playing on the word phone. Um, in this setting, Persephone, the character Persephone, is very frustrated because she feels like that she is not true to herself because she's not being able to communicate, whether that be to her friends or to her mother, in a way that seems genuine to her. In this passage, it says her words sounded so false. Couldn't anyone else see what a phony she was? Right? Even the sound of her name seemed to show it, Persephone, right? But she lacked the guts to say how she really felt about even the smallest things, right? Um, so here again is a play on the English term phony, but even her being a phony in English, right, is built upon the use and the abuse of her phone, her voice. Um, so now what happens here, right, is we'll take a look at how Hades and Persephone meet. Right? Persephone finds herself one day in circumstances in a cemetery, right, and she says it was peaceful in the cemetery. Quite lovely, in fact. Persephone smiled. She was surprised how much at home she felt here. Suddenly, right, not more than 20 feet away, the ground split open with a loud crack. Yikes! Yelled Persephone. Her hands jerked and she dropped the daisy chain into her lap as a black stallion pushed up through the gap. It reared on its hind legs and its front hooves pawed the air. A god boy sat on the stallion's back, and he seemed as startled to see Persephone as she was to see him. Um, Now, Holub has not simply omitted or recreated their meeting scene, right? She's taken the effort to represent their initial interaction in similar terms as in the ancient sources, except here, Persephone is not uncomfortable. She's rather at home in the cemetery. She is in a comfortable zone. Um, it is Hades that is uncomfortable. It is he comes through and is shocked to see her, startled to see her, and doesn't know what to make of it, of to find her there. Um, and then this is where things become complicated, right? And how do we deal with this, with reception of myth in children's literature? Because Hades does not abduct her, right? Instead, Persephone is the one that's attracted to him, right? So I read this passage. He says, um, he was cute in a dark and brooding sort of way, with flashing black eyes and a fine straight nose. Hades was from the underworld, a gloomy, lonely, horrible place, or that was a rumor anyways. Yet he didn't seem horrible, right? So he doesn't seem horrible. If anything, Persephone finds herself rather attracted to him and develops a crush on him rather fast. Um, but this attraction to Hades, right? It goes further to almost go ahead. It's more than just an attraction to the character of Hades, right? It's there is a attraction and almost a reciprocal connection between what Persephone represents and what Hades represents. So I will show this fourth passage. Um, this is Hades speaking. He says, "Show me how you can make things grow." Right? He sat back, almost daring her to rest his weight on his hand, resting his weight on his hands, almost daring her. She held up the daisy chain and gently stroked the flowers. Their green stems and white petals straightened and grew strong again, as if they were still in the ground. Right? Hades' jaw dropped. Cool. Where I come from, almost nothing grows except asphodels. Right? You've got skills. So Persephone, she can make things grow, make them grow as if they're still in the ground, right? On the other side, Hades, both he can't, nor where he comes from, right? Hades being Hades himself, and Hades being the metonymical connection to calling the entire underworld, nothing grows except when it does, which is also flowers, asphodel. I love that detail, right? But here, the realm of making things grow, right, doesn't exist without the realm of things that are dead, right? There is a reciprocal connection between each of them being able to exist. They're bonded by the idea of how their realms sort of bleed into one another, right? And that sort of becomes the bond in this book as well between Hades and Persephone, right? So thinking of this idea of, taking this idea that this piece of reception, right, in this children's literature, in this particular book, this idea that Persephone has an attraction to Hades, and that there is some sort of reciprocal connection of their realms, and how their realms sort of bleed into each other, right? Taking those thoughts with me, I now go back to the ancient source, on the hymn to Demeter, and I look at that passage I had earlier sort of skipped over, how exactly her abduction takes place. So here we are back to the hymn to Demeter, and here I'm looking at the lines that come that in the first slide, when we were looking at the hymn to Demeter, that come in between the beginning of the hymn and the fact that she is abducted by Hades, and it explains what exactly was happening when Persephone was abducted. Um, Here we're back to flowers, right? And it's not only about flowers growing, it's about picking flowers, flowers that are growing out of the ground. So we're back to the same kinds of themes. Um, Persephone is out picking flowers, right? Persephone was playing with the daughters of Okeanos, right? She was picking flowers, roses, crocus, and beautiful violets. Up and down the soft meadow, iris blossoms too she picked, and hyacinth, and the narcissus, which was grown as a lure for the flower-faced girl by Gaia, all according to the plans of Zeus. She, Gaia, was doing a favor for the one who receives many guests, that being Hades. It, the narcissus, was a wondrous thing in its splendor to look at. It, to look at it gives a sense of holy awe to the immortal gods as well as mortal humans. It has 100 heads growing from the root up. Its sweet fragrance spread over the wide skies up above, and the earth below smiled back in all its radiance, right? And Persephone is filled at wonder at this, and she reaches out to take it with both hands as if it's a toy, as if it's a plaything. And as soon as she does that, the earth, right, gapes open, and that's sort of where Hades makes his lunge, right? He comes out to seize her. Um, but looking specifically at this passage, right, there's one flower in particular that is present, that is a lure, that's a trick. It's called dolon in the Greek. I've underlined it in the passage, right, because it is there specifically to attract Persephone, and it goes further, right? This trick, this flower, is a production of Gaia. Right, Gaia is producing this. So to take a moment here, let's recall that Gaia is a very interesting figure in Greek mythology and cosmogony, especially in the theogony, produced from chaos, right? That original disorienting space, right? Gaia, in her depths, not only on her surface, she's the ground that we walk on, but in her deep depths, she also houses the underworld and Tartarus. But in her deepest depths, right, she is still somewhere deeply connected to that primordial chaos, right? And Gaia is always bringing forth things from deep inside her, things that usually affect cosmic succession or cosmic order in some way. She produces the sickle that castrates Uranus. She produces other 100 hecaton monsters, right? So it's not just this flower. The 100-handers. There's also typhus. So once again, Gaia is playing a very similar role, right? She's bringing forth this 100-headed monstrosity of a narcissus flower. Um, and Persephone is the one that goes for it, right? She's filled with wonder, right? And when she picks it, it activates this sort of trap door, right? And it activates the depths, right, that it is produced from. So I'll repeat that again, which is that, you see, I argue that when she picks that flower, right, she is sort of activating the fact that the earth is opening up and it's Hades that is coming out. She's activating, right, the depths from which this flower was produced, right? Gaia brings forth these things from deep within her, right? Um, Now, while in no way am I arguing that Persephone has agency in the abduction and rape that follows, that she somehow, brought this upon her, that is not what I'm arguing. I am interested in this passage after having looked at Persephone the phony, at the chthonic nature of Persephone, right? So is there something about Persephone, just like within Persephone the phony, right, that is built into the fact that her realm exists by bleeding into the realm of the underworld? Is there something chthonic about her? Like, why is she attracted to this narcissus flower that is brought through the depths of Gaia, through this um, and in taking a look at that, to think even further, what I'd like to do is both take a step back and a step forward by looking at the next slide for a second at the myth of Narcissus. So the myth of Narcissus, best, most well known, recorded by Ovid, is unclear whether or not in what form it existed as a Greek myth, but I think we would be remiss not to think with it, if not think that, if it was not necessarily on the minds of the ancient Greeks in the archaic period, but at least, we can think with it. And I think what really here really emphasizes this idea of Persephone and her potentially chthonic connection, right, is that Narcissus is a young boy, right, who falls in love with his own reflection, right, famously known as the story. And he looks, as you see in this painting, he's looking at his reflection and he wastes away and eventually dies in love with his own reflection, though he can never get to it, right? And the myth of Narcissus, right, there is this idea that the space between him and his reflection is collapsed, like as if there is some sort of collapse of a spatial boundary, right? Um, and in Persephone, in picking the flower, there is a similar collapse of spatial boundary, right? Of where the earth opens up and Hades, the god of the underworld, bursts through, right? Um, and there is this idea that, space sort of collapsed. And I am also reminded here, and I would like to sort of cover this idea that, the boundaries of spatial collapse, right, is, as a comparative side note, is this, it always reminds me of that image of Alice, Alice in Wonderland, just falling into the rabbit hole, right, into the ground, right, that will sort of take her somewhere else. So with that, I want to transition back into looking at Persephone the phony now, and see, well, she's not abducted, so then how does she end up in the underworld? Right now, they just had their sort of meet cute at the cemetery, but how is she going to end up in the underworld? So Persephone runs away, right? And in this passage, right, it's clear that she is unhappy with her current situation at home, which is that she finds her friends and her mother too controlling, and she's not even able to harness her phone in a way that feels genuine to her. And she says that she just couldn't continue to be the goddess girl her friends and her mom thought she was, right? Um, and then, like a bolt of lightning from Zeus, an idea struck her. She would run away, and she knew exactly where she would go, right? Um, she leaves. She leaves home, right? What is interesting is this idea of the divine agency of Zeus is still maintained, right? Even the idea, right, where the original abduction of Persephone is sanctioned by Zeus here, this idea is as if it is, directly from Zeus that she must leave. But the problem becomes that the idea of consent in that has changed, right? The idea both of them may have Zeus's divine sanction, but here the idea is that we are giving Persephone a sense of consent that was not present in the ancient source. And that is something that I'll come back to at the end of this paper. She goes to the underworld and she finds Hades, only to be shocked that, Hades will turn her around and send her back home. So she finds him and he says, "What are you doing here?" he asked as they came even, and Persephone's face fell. She thought he'd be happy to see her. I ran away from home, she told him. Why? She stared at him. He must know that he was part of the reason that no only liked her seeing him. But she couldn't quite bring herself to tell him that. Instead, she said, because everyone keeps telling me what to do, I just couldn't stand it anymore, right? Um, she goes to the underworld. She goes to Hades, right? Hades, she's there for him. She wants to run away, and this idea of this dual idea of her wanting to run away and being attracted to Hades leads her to the underworld. But she won't stay there. She will come back. Hades will actually send her back and say, "You need to go back home." And this is a very interesting part because here I think with Stott's 1978 article running away to home, a story pattern in children's literature, where you have these stories of children of the story pattern in children's literature of children running away from home. But while those stories, right, those stories can go many ways. Children can run away and never come back. Children can run away and get lost forever, right? But within that, there's one particular story pattern in which children run away eventually to come home. And sort of one very simple, short example of that kind of story that Stott also mentions is Maurice Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are, right? Where Max will go away to where the wild things are only to come back home. So something similar happens to Persephone. She doesn't run away. She doesn't get lost. She doesn't run away forever, right? She actually runs away to home, right? She's going to eventually come home. And when she comes home, she has this negotiation with her mother, where, in a very sort of setting of middle grade fiction, right, she's going to reintegrate back into home by finding more space of independence for her, right? Um, she realizes with the start, she realized that this is new, angry, daring side of her was no more real than the Persephone that went along to get along. The real her was somewhere in between, right? And alas, Demeter sighed, I guess you're right, I do need to give you more independence, right? And so she's going to settle back into her home happily. And, while, Stott argues that this children or characters that are initially run away from home in these kind of story patterns because they're frustrated with their current sort of status quo in their home, and they run away, and in the journey that they're away, before they come back home, they learn something. They acquire some sort of skill set that allows them to come back to a home in which they can function without the initial frustration or the initial burden that they had. So they're able to bring back something with them from that journey that allows them to function in their space of home better than they did before. Um, Now, what I would add to that argument is that this idea of running away from home only to come back to home, right, in children's story pattern, is also a means of delineating space, of, right, what is home and what is not, right? Running away from home to come home, having experienced what is not home, right, are establishing the different realms of a child's world. So I transition from here into how this cycle of Persephone is reflected in the ancient source. So now coming back to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Persephone, right? I say returns to Demeter. Well, kind of, right? In the end of the hymn to Demeter, Persephone is allowed to come home, but only for a certain amount of time. We are told that Zeus, assented that her daughter, every time the season came around, would spend a third of the portion of the year in the realms of dark mist underneath, and the other 2/3 in the company of her mother and the other immortals. So what is that about, right? It is usually quite superficially interpreted as some sort of seasonal connection of Persephone. It has actually more to do with the tripartite structure of cosmic space that we sort of started with the hymn to Demeter. I quote here Clay in her 1989 book, The Politics of Olympus, in which she's talking about the Homeric hymn to Demeter. The threefold division of the year corresponds to the tripartite division of the cosmos, right? The relation of the three cosmic realms forms the critical backdrop of the hymn's narrative, and the marriage of Persephone is intended to unite the triple spheres of the cosmos and the breach and the barrier separating them, right? The cyclical comings and goings of Persephone, whose temporal distribution mirrors the spatial distribution of the cosmic domains, open the desired path of communication. So we see here sort of a similar idea that, while in Persephone the Phony, you have a story pattern of a runaway child finally going home after acquired something that, again, indeed opens a communication or opens a path of communication that was formerly closed, is quite closely mirrored in this idea of, the tripartite cosmic space that is the backdrop of the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Now, to wrap up, I come back to looking at these two images together and thinking, okay, well, yes, on the positive side of things, having seen these two pieces together allows us to come back to both with new thoughts and dig deeper essentially into who is Persephone, right? What is the myth of Persephone? What are the themes that are sort of make it function? Um, but on the darker side of things, right, I come back to the second part of my argument is that, yes, we obscure violence and sexual violence, especially sexual violence such as rape in children's literature, and there's an understandable reason for that, right? I'm not arguing that we should not obscure rape in children's literature. We obscure sexual violence because we have certain psychological understanding of when children are ready to absorb complicated matters such as gendered sexual violence, right? But what I am worried about is that are we cognizant that in obscuring that, right, we're also obscuring consent, which need not be obscured, right? By giving Persephone a desire for Hades, the consent that is not in the ancient source in the myth, right, we are potentially no less at fault of abusing Persephone as is Hades, right? By reinscribing the rape of Persephone, we are diluting the very heavy and relevant topic of the appropriation of the female body, right? Where we are, um, where we are we thinking deeply enough of how that works, especially for a target audience of young girls? And as I think about this, I can't help myself but end on one more image, which is that in 2017, right, the person of the year was a group, and the group were called the Silence Breakers, right? The women who spoke out and who started the Me Too movement, um, and they are called the silence breaker. And every time I think of Persephone and I think of her phone and I think of coming back to this idea of why her phone and how it's dealt with is so important, especially when we're talking about literature that is aimed for young girls in our society with current issues that plague us, right? I think these are very relevant topics. And I am way over time, so I would like to end here with this idea that there is space for us to think more deeply about how we deal with sexual violence and rape in children's literature, and how we can potentially deal or uh, deal with complexities in a perhaps more balanced way. Um, Thank you so much. I wish I could hear some beautiful feedback, and I hope that in the future there will be a chance for that to happen. Um, Thank you.